All right, guys. Hello. Good morning. So this is our last lecture for Unit 4. This is our last bit of information that you guys are going to get. On Friday, we talked about the transition that has happened within our civil rights as we get into the mid to late 1960s and how people, well, comes right down to it, they're pretty disillusioned and unwilling at this point to move forward with this. Again, they're kind of getting set in their ways one way or the other. And violence has become much more commonplace within this, where nonviolence had been sort of the beginning of this movement. Now we're seeing a lot more violent clashes throughout, including in Milwaukee, where we talked about, again, Father Grappi and Vel Phillips, what they were doing for the civil rights movement in Milwaukee itself, successes, failures that they were running into. What we're going to end today with, and then tomorrow you're not going to have any new lecture, but I will be putting out a little review thing, is going to be 1968, which is more or less looked at as the end of the civil rights movement proper. It's important to understand that the fight for equality, it can't really be, again, wrapped up with a neat little bow saying it starts here, it ends here, because ultimately civil rights and fighting for equality continues. The best way to describe it is kind of how we've talked about the KKK, to be honest, is that they kind of fade in and out of history depending on what's going on. By 1968, the United States have got a lot of other things on their plate, and the civil rights movement starts to get sort of moved to the back of the line as far as priorities go. And 1968 is kind of looked at as that final year where people are going to focus on it because lots of other things are going to be going on at that moment in time. So grab out your notebooks one last time, and we're going to talk about 1968. So by this time, the civil rights movement will have developed different factions. MLK, who with again the SCLC had been leading a pretty singular campaign in how do you fight for civil rights, which is nonviolence, which is, again, perseverance, that kind of stuff. But the introduction of the Black Power movement, where people were taking control of their own fight, and a lot of them utilizing more armed and aggressive means of fighting, was something that MLK spoke very openly about, how it can only end in tragedy and grief. And to be honest, he wasn't wrong. Again, a lot of this process is going to be resulting in more and more casualties, more damage, all of that than even the protests, which always ended with a lot of violence with in the South, also did. It's just a different kind of violence. Again, MLK in 1968 was continued to do all that he could for civil rights, again, going from place to place and giving speeches and leading demonstrations. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the transcripts of those speeches and things like that, because there's a certain ominous tone that MLK starts to adopt. He had plans to lead a march, but the speech before alluded to the fact that he probably wouldn't be there and they have to continue on. It's an interesting tone shift for him. And it was kind of prophetic, because in the end, Martin Luther King is going to be assassinated. On April 4th, 1968, he's shot by a guy by the name of James Earl Ray while he is standing outside of his hotel room, again, getting ready to lead this march the next day, that he had already alluded to the fact that he probably wouldn't be there. So it's a pretty kind of crazy thing. And of course, it's a tragedy on a different level, in my opinion, just because, again, he had done so much for the African American community, for us as a nation, really, and to meet such a violent end, being such a nonviolent person, is really rough. He's not the only person who is going to meet an untimely death in 1968. Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, also will be assassinated, which kind of just like so much sadness for one family overall. But he had been campaigning to run for president in that year, actually. He wanted to get the Democratic nomination. to try and unseat LBJ. And when he received news of MLK's death, he really started to incorporate more into his campaigning, us urging towards nonviolence and trying to, again, follow MLK's example and to talking about civil rights and what he would do as president. And he'll also be assassinated in June of that same year. So things have reached a fever pitch. 68 is going to see the worst urban rioting in US history. Over 100 cities are going to explode in violent clashes and in people looting and damage and all of this stuff. 68 is a really tough year to live in the United States. We're embroiled in the Vietnam conflict, and we have all of these people just frustrated, so frustrated, right? Of course, this kind of reaching a peak of violence and terror in the United States in regards to the civil rights movement is going to force LBJ to put together a commission. We've talked about commissions before. They're just, again, panels of experts, basically. So in 68, he's going to put together a commission to study the cause of urban violence. Why is it that now, after again 10 years plus, like almost 15 years of this civil rights movement, and why is it now that all of these demonstrations seem to end or to erupt into serious violence? And unsurprisingly, the Kerner Commission, this series of experts, are going to determine that the reason that cities keep erupting in such intense violence is because of white racism, because the white population in cities are so unwilling to give up any of their power or control that the customs and the way that they've lived their lives, they're asking them to change and they don't want to. So the Kerner Commission this is the suggestions that they have. One, create new jobs, give African Americans a chance to better their lives through economic growth. They are going to suggest that they construct a lot of new housing. Again, housing and fair housing is one of the big issues that it keeps happening in a lot of cities. That's what Milwaukee's most of their most violent clashes were going to be about. And they talking about ending de facto segregation. Remembering de facto is by custom or law or practice. Unfortunately, a lot of these suggestions get ignored because LBJ is in the middle of a campaign year, and there's a lot of really big opposition that he shouldn't take. Again, people are just tired. They're tired of talking about civil rights. They're tired about this process. They're like, some changes happen. There's all these things. Why do they keep asking for more? So what LBJ ends up doing is passing the Civil Rights Act of 68. The Civil Rights Act, this major federal decision, prohibits discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. It's also going to strengthen anti-lynching laws. There's still a lot of obviously racially motivated violence that's going on. It's going to make it a crime and a federal offense if you harm a civil rights worker. So trying to protect those who are still fighting and still demonstrating and all of that kind of stuff. Um, the Again, other sort of process that comes out of the civil rights movement, besides our three laws, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights of 65, and the Civil Rights Act of 68, is that by the time we get to the end of the 1960s, the African American community within America have just they've come into their own a little bit. A lot of the pre-civil rights movement, African Americans were just trying to get by, fitting in as best as they could, or just accepting what is been given to them. And now they're taking their lives into their own hands. They're much more proud to be African American. Again, understanding that there is definitely, you got to be proud of where you come from. And even though for years and years and years, white Americans made blacks feel bad about who they are and where they're from, now by the time we get to the end of the 60s, they've kind of just changed their tune. They've recognized they fought and they've struggled and they're sick of it. They're tired. So they're going to just be proud of who they are, where they come from. You're going to start to see in fashion and in the music and in all kinds of different layers of American experience that African styles are going to become much more prevalent. In entertainment, by the time we get to the end of the 60s, there's been a lot of attempts to diversify. You start to see more and more, again, African Americans being cast in films and in television, represented in a much more realistic way as opposed to the stereotypical way that we saw in the 1950s, giving them more of a chance. Again, politically, there are way more African American voters than there ever had been, and we're going to start to see that there's more representation in public office. Again, African Americans being elected in holding positions of power and control, which before this movement would never have happened. So, though this is all kind of coming to an end on a really sour note, in the fact that there's been so much violence, there are things that have changed by the conclusion of this 15 odd years of fighting and pushing and again demonstrating and all that kind of stuff. And for the most part, those are the good things. Of course, you've got the laws, you've got the changes, but we know that there's still work to be done in this particular situation. And there isn't perfect equality in our country. There isn't perfect equality in any country. We've, of course, been had made a lot of progress during this time. There's a lot of change that happened, but by the time we get to the 70s, public opinion and support for this fight for equality has really shifted away from it. By the 70s, Vietnam is pretty much all we can talk and think about, and that's what our next unit is going to be. So there is still a lot of, again, just unfinished work. There's a lot of attitudes and behaviors that have stuck around even throughout this whole process. A lot of proposed solutions were dismissed or abandoned. White flight was still in progress. You still had a disproportionate amount of minorities left behind in cities where, again, white suburban neighborhoods continued to flourish. And something that was created, and it's a pretty controversial topic still to this day, something from the Great Society programming that LBJ created, and it's this idea of affirmative action. Affirmative action programs are basically a requirement for education, public education, and businesses that they have to make special efforts to hire or enroll groups that have suffered from discrimination. So that, of course, is minorities. We're going to see people with disabilities are going to be part of affirmative action. But those are kind of the two big groups. Women will also be considered affirmative action hires from time to time. But colleges and companies that have any kind of connection to the federal government, they have to adopt this process. This, at its heart, at its most simple, is it makes sense. It's about trying to give people opportunities that have been denied opportunities in the past. But unfortunately, in practice, there's a lot of not so good stuff about this. And the biggest thing with affirmative action is reverse discrimination. So, what ends up happening here is instead of hiring the best option, you just are hiring those to meet quotas. And that is pretty much exactly what was wrong with the hiring process before this, is that they would just give jobs to whites who didn't deserve it and they would overlook those who were not. So again, it's still under fire today. A lot of people have walked away from this. Again, not they don't do it anymore. There have been huge leaps and huge changes in America throughout this movement, but it's still a work in progress. As you know, to this day, there are still issues of inequality within our nation. But like I said, that's not just the United States. There's a lot of countries that are similar to us that have problems with this, lingering issues or behaviors and understandings from long, long ago. So that's it. That's all of the information for Unit 4. Some quick, again, reminders about stuff to be done this week. Again, this is our last week. Well, this is our week before spring break. Again, you don't have a lecture tomorrow, but you should check it out. I'm going to have a little review thing. That's just an option for people who are looking for some more preparation stuff. You do have an assignment out there right now, which is writing up a little bit of a back and forth, a scripted conversation between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. They're talking about the best way to get equality. And of course, through your notes, you should know that they have two very different opinions on how to get equality found. I would like to see specifics, so names and events and things like that should get brought up into it if you want to get full credit. There's also the review packet that's out there. As always, it's optional, something that you can have. Wednesday. That is your next assessment. This one is going to be on Google Forms again, but there's some more variety in the questions and styles. Please make sure that you're budgeting time so that you can get that finished. Again, it'll be open through 4 p.m. on Wednesday. Late responses, like the last time, will be accepted, but for points lost. So please keep that in mind. Don't forget also, big important project due after spring break. Again, on Monday the 20th, your local history project is due, the audio, as well as just a list of your final questions that need to be submitted to me. Hope you guys are all good and that this week goes well for you. I will talk to you all later.